Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Trace Your New England Roots. In this latest installment of our Developing Family Narratives and Genealogy series, we'll explore how major historical events, wars, migrations, economic shifts, and more helped shape your family's unique story. By connecting your ancestors' lives to the broader currents of history, you'll uncover new layers of meaning in your family's journey. Most of us think our families are, well, ordinary. We have our stories, our inside jokes, our traditions, maybe even a few faded photo albums tucked away in a closet. But when we look at them, the people and places can feel so small, so completely disconnected from the grand, sweeping narrative of history you read about in textbooks. That's the big stuff. The stuff that happened to kings and generals, and we are just as and it and we are just us. Our history feels personal, contained, and well, quiet. But then a single clue can detonate that quiet and make you question everything you thought you knew. Imagine you're idly flipping through a box of old papers and you find a faded photograph of a great-great-grandfather. He's standing there, a young man with a startlingly intense expression, wearing a rough-looking military uniform that you don't recognize at all. It isn't from World War I or World War II, the big ones that we all learn about, the ones with stories attached. This photo has no stories, just a name and a date scrawled on the back in elegant fading ink. Well, who was this person really? What war was he even fighting in? And why has no one even spoken of it? What if you decided to pull at that single loose thread? You might discover that your family's story isn't ordinary in the slightest. It isn't some straight, predictable line from the past to the present. It's a twisting and turning journey forged by famine, brutally redirected by war, shattered and rebuilt by economic disaster, and secretly written by some of the most monumental events of the last several centuries. This is how we learn that history isn't just something that happens to other people and other places. It happened to our families, and it most certainly happened to yours too. So join us today on Trace Your New England Roots. It can all start with that single enigmatic photograph. The first puzzle is often the uniform, a silent costume from a forgotten play. Imagine a simple dark tunic with a really distinctive, almost oddly shaped cap. The first move is to figure out what it is, and this is where the modern quest begins. You might scan the photo, enhancing its details, and post it on obscure online history forums where passionate experts gather. You might spend weeks scrolling through digital databases of military uniforms, your eyes blurring from the endless parade of braids, buttons, and brass. For weeks, nothing matches. It can be incredibly frustrating and a maddening exercise in chasing a ghost who left behind only a single cryptic image. Then, just when you're about to shelve the project, a breakthrough. A retired historian on a genealogy forum halfway across the country recognizes a tiny, barely visible insignia on the cap. The reason you couldn't find it, he explains, is that it isn't a well-known federal uniform. It's from a state volunteer regiment. He points you toward a conflict you barely remember from school, the Mexican-American War. A bloody and consequential war fought from 1846 to 1847. It's a chapter of American history that's often completely overshadowed by the Civil War that would erupt just over a decade later. Suddenly, a locked door swings open. You have a whole new direction, a new context. You're not just looking for a name anymore. You're looking for a specific kind of soldier. You dive into the world of military archives, searching newly digitized state volunteer rosters. The records are handwritten and the cursive is a challenge to decipher. And then, after hours of squinting at the screen, you find it, a digital scan of a muster roll for a volunteer infantry regiment. And there, on the third page, amongst the list of other young men, is his name. Seeing a name on that official document is electrifying. It feels like a jolt of lightning, connecting you directly to him. And this isn't some fuzzy family legend. This is documented, verifiable proof. But this discovery just opens up a bigger and more profound question. Why would a young immigrant who had only just recently arrived in New York volunteer to join a war being fought hundreds of miles away on the Texas-Mexico border? The answer isn't just about personal ambition. It's about the harsh realities of the world he was living in. For many desperate immigrants of that era, military service was a fast track to American citizenship. Even more importantly, the government was offering bounties of land grants as payment for service. So for someone who likely showed up with nothing but the clothes on his back, the promise of owning a piece of America must have been a monumental, life-altering incentive. His decision to enlist wasn't just a choice, it was a product of the historical forces swirling around him. He becomes a perfect, tangible example of how history creates difficult choices and desperate opportunities that can shape a family's entire future. Okay, so the mystery of the unfamiliar uniform is solved. He was a soldier in a forgotten war, but that just peels back one layer of the onion, revealing a deeper, more fundamental mystery. What was a young man from County Cork, Ireland? What was a young man from County Cork, Ireland doing in New York City during the 1840s in the first place? All we have is a vague, generalized image of Irish immigrants coming to America. But the goal of this journey is to get past the stereotype and find the individual human being. So the next more daunting phase of the investigation begins, finding his passage to America. This is the holy grail for many family historians, and it's also one of the hardest things to find. A name like Michael Sullivan is incredibly it's hopelessly common. Ship manifests from that time were handwritten, often by semi-literate clerks. The spelling was wildly inconsistent, and the documents contained barely any detail. No hometown, no family members. You could spend months sifting through online databases looking at thousands of names, cross-referencing and searching for a man of the right age, traveling alone, and arriving in the years before he enlisted. There are dozens, even hundreds of false starts. Each one is a small dead end, a moment of hope followed by disappointment. Now, you might be about to give up, resigning yourself to the idea that this part of his story is just lost to the void of time. Then, one late night, bleary-eyed from staring at scanned documents, you try a different tactic. Instead of searching by name, you search for ships that departed from the main port in County Cork and just widen the date range, preparing to manually scroll through every passenger. And there he is, on the manifest for a ship called the Emerald, which arrived in the port of New York on May 10th, 1847. The record is sparse, barely a whisper of a life, a name, an age of 19, as an occupation he was a laborer. But then your eyes drift to the final column, a section you hadn't noticed on other passenger lists. It's a note, a notation added by the ship's clerk in a slightly different hand. A single gut-wrenching word that explains everything. Famine. Your heart just stops. It's a moment of shocking, clarifying horror. He wasn't just an immigrant seeking a better life. He was a refugee. He was one of the 1.5 million desperate souls who fled Ireland during the Great Famine, a period of mass starvation, disease, and death that completely decimated the population. The potato blight, a catastrophic event in global history, had reached with its invisible hand into his small village and violently thrown him across an ocean. He didn't come to America looking for an adventure or an opportunity in the way that we think of it. He came here to survive. He was running from certain death. Now suddenly this story isn't just about one man. It's the story of an entire generation displaced by a national catastrophe. That single word on a ship's manifest powerfully connects an ordinary family to one of the most tragic migrations of the 19th century. His journey wasn't a choice, not in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a desperate, panicked flight for his life. The life he would build, the family he would start, the entire lineage that leads to you. None of it would have happened in America if not for a microscopic fungus that destroyed a nation's food supply. A family's very existence on this continent could be that direct, improbable result of that crisis. That moment of discovery, finding that one single handwritten word on a document that changes everything you thought you knew. That is the entire reason that we do this. It's a feeling you can't describe. But let's be honest, folks. The process we just walked through, sifting through thousands of barely legible handwritten records from the 1840s, can feel absolutely impossible. Now, before the digital age, it often was. It meant physical trips to national archives, weeks spent in dusty basements, and an incredible amount of sheer dumb luck. That's where having the right tools makes all the difference in the world. Services that have undertaken the monumental task of digitizing historical records are fundamental to this work that we do as genealogists. They take these fragile, scattered, often forgotten documents from ship manifests and census records to military muster rolls, draft cards, and bring them into a single searchable digital database. It's this incredible technology that allows us to find that one specific Michael Sullivan among thousands, to filter by age, location, and arrival date, and to have that earth-shattering breakthrough moment in a single evening from our living room or our office, instead of it taking a decade of dedicated, frustrating work. If you're feeling that spark, that inspiration to start untangling your own family's past, this is absolutely the place to start. I've put a list of links in the description below to some of the very best resources and websites out there for genealogical research. The ones that I use to piece together stories just like this one. It's the perfect way to take that first step, to turn a half-remembered family legend or a faded photograph into a real, tangible human story. But using these links, you're also helping to support the channel, which allows me to keep digging into these incredible stories and sharing them with you. Click on the like and subscribe buttons. Now, let's get back to our story. A young man has survived a famine. He's fought in a war and earned his place in a new country. So what happens next? Let's say that this ancestor, our famine refugee and war veteran, survived the war, claimed his land grant, and like so many others, moved his family west, settling outside a booming industrial city like Chicago. For 2 generations, the family lives the American dream that he had fought and bled for. His son, we'll call him Thomas, becomes a skilled craftsman, a worker in a furniture factory. The U.S. Census records from 1910 and 1920 paint a clear picture of stability and upward mobility. He is listed as a homeowner. His children are in school, and the family is on a steady rising path. He has a level of security and peace his own father, the boy who fled starvation, could only have dreamed of. But then The family story takes another sharp, brutal turn, driven by a historical force far beyond their control. The 1930 census might still show things as stable, the calm before the storm. The 1940 census, though, could tell a completely different, heartbreaking story. Reading it might feel like you're looking at a different family entirely. They are no longer in the house they had owned for 20 years. They are now listed as renters in a crowded multifamily apartment in a less desirable part of town now. And next to Thomas's name, in the occupation column, where skilled woodworker once sat, are two stark words: no occupation. You don't need a specific document to explain what happened in the intervening years. The whole world knows what happened. The Great Depression. Between 1929 and 1933, the average American family's income plummeted by a staggering 40%. Millions of families lost their savings overnight. Their jobs disappeared. Their homes were foreclosed on. This wasn't a personal failure on Thomas's part. It was a global economic collapse that landed like a bomb on their doorstep, wiping out a generation of progress. But the census can hold another quieter and more heroic story. While the husband Thomas has no job, his wife, and let's call her Mary, she does. For the very first time in any record of her life, she is listed with an occupation. She's a seamstress, working piecemeal from home. This tiny detail in a government document speaks volumes about how the Depression didn't just wreck finances, it completely and permanently restructured families. With millions of men, the sole breadwinners of the era, out of work, women and even older children were pulled into the workforce in any way they could to keep their families from starving. This woman, Mary, who had been a homemaker her entire adult life, is now the one bringing in what little precious money they have. This crisis redefined their roles and their relationship. The strain on families during this time was immense. This family, however, held together. The family you see in that 1940 census is one forged in profound hardship, a family that learned to be resilient and resourceful because they had no other choice. That decade of making do, of patching clothes and stretching meals, became a core part of their family's identity, passed down not as a grand historical narrative, but through quiet stories about constant uncertainty and the silent strength of a matriarch who held everything together with a needle and thread. It's very, very powerful. Now imagine the son in that family. Let's call him Arthur, who grew up entirely in the long, dark shadow of the Great Depression. His entire childhood was defined by scarcity, by his parents' anxiety, and by the constant gnawing of uncertainty of what might come next. For his generation, the optimistic American dream of the 1920s, it must have seemed like a cruel, distant joke. Stability was a fantasy to him. But then, just as it had for his grandfather a century before, another huge historical event came along and offered an unexpected and frankly unmanageable path forward. It was a path born from the horror of a global war, but it would ultimately lift millions of American families, including this one, into a new and lasting kind of prosperity. And that event was World War II. The first document you might find for this young man, Arthur, is his draft card. It's such a simple, unassuming piece of paper filled out in his own youthful, perhaps slightly nervous handwriting. But that card represents a massive life-altering turning point. Like 16 million other Americans, he was swept up by the war effort. He might have served in the Navy, in the Pacific Theater, witnessing things he would never, ever talk about, and eventually come home a profoundly changed young man. But the war's most lasting impact on his family and on the country came after it was over. In 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which we all now know as the GI Bill. It was, without exaggeration, one of the most transformative pieces of legislation in American history. It offered veterans low-cost mortgages, unemployment benefits for a full year, and most importantly, money for an education. For a young man like Arthur, a child of the Depression, the GI Bill was a ticket to a life his father, who lost everything, could never, ever have conceived of. He had finished high school, of course, but a university education was a world away, reserved only for the wealthy. It just simply wasn't a possibility for a boy with his background. With the help of the GI Bill, he could enroll at a state university and become an engineer. This single government act changed the entire trajectory of that family forever. Within about a decade of its passage, the GI Bill had helped millions of veterans get an education, and as a result, the number of people with college degrees in the United States more than doubled. This hypothetical grandfather was part of that massive, upwardly mobile wave. His engineering degree secured him a stable, professional, white-collar job. It allowed him to buy a brand new house in the suburbs, part of the massive housing boom, also fueled by those GI Bill loans. Most significantly, he was able to give his own children a comfortable, secure, middle-class upbringing, an environment where it was simply expected that they too would go to college. The journey is suddenly so incredibly clear. A famine in Ireland sends an ancestor to America. A war for territory gives him land and a new start. A global depression nearly wipes out the family. And another world war, coupled with the smart, visionary legislation that followed it, catapulted his grandson into the heart of the American middle class. This family's climb wasn't just about their own hard work and perseverance. It was directly and undeniably enabled by historical events and government policy. You might think the main epic story is complete now. You follow this dramatic path from the desperate shores of Ireland to the manicured lawns of post-war America. It's a powerful story of resilience, driven by these huge, recognizable historical forces. But sometimes there can be one more thread to pull. A quieter, more personal story that's incredibly easy to miss. It can be hidden not on a battlefield or in a financial collapse, but in the dry, tedious language of the law. The mystery might emerge on another side of the family entirely. Imagine trying to fill out the family tree for a grandmother and hitting a strange, inexplicable wall with her mother. You might know that she had immigrated from England in 1920 and married an American-born man in 1921. But as you look through the records, her citizenship status is a total mess. The documents are conflicting. One consensus lists her as an alien, the next is naturalized, and there's a strange multi-year delay in her official naturalization paperwork that just doesn't make any sense. Frustrated, you start digging not into genealogy records, but into the history of United States citizenship law itself. And that's when you find it. The Cable Act of 1922. This little known law, a footnote in most history books, was a pivotal moment for women's rights in America. Before 1922, a legal doctrine known as derivative citizenship meant that an immigrant woman who married an American man automatically became a citizen. Her legal identity was completely subsumed by her husband's. The Cable Act was intended to be progressive legislation it was born from the suffrage movement, giving women their own independent national status. But its implementation created a bureaucratic nightmare, and your hypothetical great-grandmother fell right into this historical crack. She married her American husband in 1921, a single year before the Cable Act passed. Under the old law, she should have become a citizen automatically upon her marriage. But by the time they filed the official paperwork, the new law was in effect, which now required her to file for a separate, independent naturalization process. For a few years, women like her were stuck in a kind of legal limbo, caught between two conflicting and confusing sets of rules. This discovery doesn't have the epic drama of a famine or a world war, but in its own way, it's just as profound. It reveals that history isn't only about the big, loud, violent events. It's also about the quiet, procedural, and administrative changes that shape and complicate individual lives. The long, hard-fought battle for women's suffrage and their right to vote and the legal reforms that followed had a direct, tangible, and deeply confusing effect on this one woman's life. It's a powerful reminder that our ancestors' journeys were shaped not just by what was happening in the world, but by what was being written on the law books. So we can imagine looking again at that faded photograph of a great-great-grandfather, a man whose face was a complete mystery, but now we can truly see him. We see the gnawing hunger that drove him from his home. We see the fear and hope of an ocean crossing, and we see the grit and pragmatism that led him to fight in a war for a country that wasn't even his yet, all for the promise of a small piece of land to call his own. His story flows directly into his sons, who grabbed a hold of precious stability only to have it ripped away by the Great Depression. A global crisis that forced his wife, a woman we'd never have known about, to become the family's rock. And their story of hardship flows now into their son, a boy of the Depression who became a man of the greatest generation, lifted by the GI Bill into a future of security and education his parents could only have dreamed of. And all of it weaves together with a grandmother's quiet story, whose very identity as an American citizen was defined by the long and complicated battle for women's rights. A family's journey. A family's journey isn't a simple list of names and dates on a chart. It's a living, breathing story, carved, shaped, and redirected by the forces of history. A potato blight in Ireland put an ancestor on a boat. A war for a territory pushed his family west. The catastrophic collapse of the global economy taught them how to survive. A world war and a visionary law gave them their definitive foothold in the American dream. Knowing this doesn't just change how we see the past, it changes how we see ourselves right now. It completely redefines that word ordinary. There is absolutely nothing ordinary about survival. There's absolutely nothing ordinary about migration. There's nothing ordinary about the resilience passed down through generations, often silently, often without us even knowing it. It helps us understand the grit that's baked into our DNA, the immense sacrifices we never knew were made for us, and the sheer, improbable, mind-boggling luck of it all. Our family's journeys weren't ordinary at all. They were extraordinary. And I am absolutely convinced so is yours. You just have to start digging. That's why this is so important to me. It's so much more than a hobby. It's a profound way to connect our own small personal lives to the epic of human history. It's a way to understand. It's a way to understand that we're all part of it, that these massive events left their fingerprints all over our family trees. So what's the biggest mystery in your family history? Is there a photograph you can't explain? A story from your grandmother that just doesn't quite add up? An ancestor who just disappears from all the records? Let me know in the comments below. I really do read every single one, and I love hearing about the puzzles and the questions that you're trying to solve in your own past. And if you want me, or if you want to join me on more journeys like this to uncover the hidden stories of the past, make sure you subscribe to the channel and click that notification bell so you don't miss what's next. You never know. You never know what we'll find.